When we talk about America's policy or policy of the United States government, it can be broken down into two types. One is domestic, the other is foreign policy. In this video talk, we're going to cover foreign policy. Who makes it and why is it such a big deal? So if you think about the Earth today and all the nations on the planet, it's a complicated business to interact with all of them in a way that benefits the United States and in most cases would benefit the other country. When foreign policy is going well, America is thriving and the world is at peace. If foreign policy breaks down, then there's economic problems, there's humanitarian problems, and ultimately war. But it is a huge chunk of the president's responsibility to negotiate and to be the representative of the United States to other countries. So the first thing you have to remember is when we talk about foreign policy, we're talking about primarily the president's or the people who work for the president's responsibility. A member of Congress from Iowa can't negotiate with India. That's not their job. That's not what they do. A governor of, say, the state of Ohio can't enter into a treaty with another nation. It's only the national government headed by the president. So as you look at the screen with all the nations of the world, some of those nations we have good foreign relations with, good connection, but some we are at odds often with. And so it just depends on the time, the decade, what's going on in the world. But generally, the goal of the American foreign policy is to coexist and to thrive, and in any way we can help other nations. But it's been a bit of a challenge because not every nation wants to be our friend, not every nation wants to work with us, and of course we don't agree with every nation's approach to government or how they handle their citizens. So it's a very complicated business, but primarily this business falls to the president. So according to our Constitution, foreign policy is the president's responsibility. Now, of course, the president isn't going to be in contact with every nation of the world every day. He has a team of people who work for him, ambassadors, people at the State Department, in the military, that represent the president around the world. Now, this comes from the Constitution. It is one of the president's main responsibilities. But also in the Constitution, it does say that the Senate, the upper house of Congress, has some responsibility and some say in foreign policy. We'll talk about that more in a moment. But generally speaking, throughout history, it has been the President of the United States who is the face and the voice of America. And so when the United States wants to deal with another country, it is the President or someone from the President's team that would reach out to another country, negotiate, talk to, come up with a treaty or an agreement. But as you look at this slide, you can see various presidents doing what presidents do, representing America, speaking for America, leading America around the world. But if you are the president, you aren't the only one, right? Your number one advisor would probably be the Secretary of State. So the president would pick the Secretary of State who would be in the cabinet and advise the president on diplomatic issues or foreign affairs issues. And the president may not be able to travel to another country. He is or she has a lot to do in this country. So the president can delegate some of that responsibility to the Secretary of State. Now, the Secretary of State has several assistants and hundreds, if not thousands of people that work in the Department of State who their only job is to make sure that relations between the United States and other nations is solid and benefiting the United States primarily, but also trying to assist and help other nations. So the Department of State is the big one. The Secretary of State is the cabinet level position that helps the president as the president deals with other nations. Also, in dealing with other nations, you have to factor in the Department of Defense. Generally, we think of this as if things break down and there's maybe a conflict, but the military does provide other humanitarian and helps to other countries in times of need. So the Secretary of Defense and those people who work for the military also advise the president on how we should interact with other nations. This usually falls when things are going badly, whether there's a humanitarian crisis or we're on the verge of war, but they are part of the team. And finally, the president does have people who work for him, which are part of the Central Intelligence Agency. These people you maybe think of as people who maybe are in other nations, who sometimes are overtly working for America, which means everybody knows that they're Americans and they're working for the American government. And then sometimes they are covertly working, which means they're undercover, or maybe we would use the word spy. I don't think they use that word too much when you're talking. Like if you ask someone from the Central Intelligence Agency if they're a spy, if they were, they probably couldn't tell you. And I don't know, we use that word a lot, but they are maybe undercover. They are doing counterintelligence work. So this is not really a cabinet level position. I mean, they're not in line for the presidency, I should say, if something were to happen to the president, if you're the director of the CIA. But if you are going to be the director of the CIA, you have to be approved by the Senate. So I would say maybe it's better to say they do go to cabinet level meetings, but they're not in line should something happen to the president. So you have the Department of State, which is the main part of our government that develops foreign policy, how we interact with other nations, as individual nations or as regions. That's the main group of people who work for the president in that area, followed by probably the Department of Defense and the Central Intelligence Agency. But the Constitution does say that the Senate has some oversight of foreign policy. So the president is not a king. He can't do whatever he wants. So there is the Constitution of the United States that says that the Senate will have oversight. So they approve any treaties that the president might make with another nation. If they don't approve it, then the treaty is dead. They also have to approve ambassadors. So if the president obviously can't be in South Africa every day, the United States would appoint an ambassador. The president would appoint an ambassador to South Africa, and that person would represent America in the absence of the president. The president would appoint an ambassador to Russia or Panama. These are all approved by the Senate. And of course, the Senate has a Foreign Relations Committee. And the Foreign Relations Committee is those on the Senate that provide some oversight and maybe even tell the president no, should the president decide to do something. Of course, the president doesn't have to really listen to the committee. It gets kind of in a gray area because the president is the person charged by the Constitution to be the leader of our nation around the world. So the Senate could advise and maybe tell him no, but ultimately the president could do it. And if there was a major conflict between the two, ultimately the Supreme Court would work it out. But generally the Supreme Court says it's the president's prerogative. And then the president can only go so far. Of course, he can't break the law. And if Congress has passed a law that tells the president to do certain things, and the president doesn't listen to that, then the president could be in trouble, could be impeached, and possibly removed. But we've never removed a president. So when we think about America's diplomatic options, there are several things the president can do in dealing with other nations. The big one, of course, is negotiating treaties. So this is the Treaty of Paris, which was the one that was negotiated at the end of the American Revolution, which is kind of ironic because we didn't even have a president yet. But this was our first treaty that ended the American Revolution in 1783. It would be a few years before he would actually write the Constitution and create the office of the president. But from the very beginning of America's birth, we had a treaty that said we will be a country. We won. We get a certain amount of land from England. This is 1783. So really, maybe it's more helpful to look at a more recent one. This is a treaty that was passed in 2021 between the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia. And This is more about a military alliance. I think the details are about where Australia would get technology for nuclear submarines. And surprisingly, this made a lot of American allies angry that we were helping Australia develop nuclear submarines. But again, the president could negotiate this treaty with Australia and the United Kingdom, but if the Senate says no to it, then it's a dead treaty. But generally, everybody was on board with this one in the Senate. But there are other options besides treaties. The president can impose economic sanctions. They can cut off money to other nations. They can freeze other nations' bank accounts if they have any money in America or in American banks. The president can decide not to allow American goods to go to that country. Economic trade embargoes. They can send food or withhold food from nations that aren't playing nice with everyone else. More recently in the news, you've seen the United States and American companies helping out with vaccines for COVID-19. And so the president and his team would figure out who's getting what, who's not getting anything, and really decide what countries are going to have interaction with the United States. So import-export, that's a big one. And the president really has a lot of power in this area, and there's not much that Congress can do about it. Because even if they did, they would have to get all the votes to pass a law or pass some rules for the president to have to abide by. But generally speaking, the president is pretty powerful in this area. So we don't think Iran is being nice. The president can sanction Iran. The president may think Cuba is not doing what the world wants Cuba to do. So in the past, the president has ordered an embargo on Cuba. So you can see from this image that people who made this didn't think America was too nice for embargoing Cuba in this political cartoon. And Cuba was in fact isolated from America and the West for a long time, and it's just recently coming online as President Obama a few years ago lifted the embargo. But it had powerful impact on Cuba's development. And so today Cuba is not really with the rest of the developed world. But besides all of those things, if those things fail, economic sanctions and import-export cutting off and ebb and flow of imports and exports, and diplomacy, when that fails, that's when you get conflict. And of course, you know that only the Congress can declare war, but it's up to the president to fight that war. And of course, technically the Congress hasn't declared war in 80 years. We've fought many wars since then. The president has the great power to fight wars really without a declaration of war. And Congress has given the president broad powers even in that area. Now, if it drags on for a while, like maybe in Vietnam, the president is told by Congress, you got to wrap this up, or we're going to need to vote on something to give you more power. But generally, when foreign diplomacy and foreign policy fails, we get conflict. So that's when wars develop. And so America has been involved in several wars since World War II. Korea, Vietnam, Persian Gulf, Afghanistan. This is the result of when foreign policy just doesn't work. But foreign policy now is how we interact with everyone else, how they interact with us, the other 200 or some nations in the world. The president primarily makes it, but he has a team, usually the Department of State, the military, and the CIA. But the Senate has some role in it. And it's such a big deal because it often can lead to war if it is not handled well. And if it's a humanitarian crisis, millions of people could die from starvation or disease. And sometimes it falls on the world's leading countries like the United States to help those nations in need.